Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create an Interference Dragon card with Prismacolor pencils. I'm using this Snapdragon stamp set from Pink Ink Designs, and I've used it in a recent video with some Cloud9 interference inks, and I had so much fun making those cards. I just had to make another one, but I didn't want to do a watercolor one again because I used the Cloud9 interference inks with watercolor. I wanted to do it in a little bit of a different way. So I'm going to do Prismacolor pencils. So I'm using some Bristol cardstock for my card, and if you saw my last video, you know this dragon stamp is really quite large, so I'm going to be making a 5x7 card. I've cut down my Bristol cardstock down to 4.5 by 6.5 inches. And I am using the sentiment that says, if you don't like the heat, don't pet the dragon or don't touch the dragon. Different sentiment than I used in the last one. Because I'm using Prismacolor pencils, I'm going to use some black StazOn to stamp my image, and I am going to stamp it twice. I'm using my Misti stamping tool so that when I stamp it the second time, I know I've got perfect placement from where I had it in the first time. And using that Misti stamping tool really comes in handy when you're doing this. Knowing that you're going to get the exact placement of the image is fantastic. I'm also using a stamp pressure tool to press around because this stamp is so large, and I don't want to use my fingers because I don't want to get uneven pressure all over. Now, because I'm using StazOn ink, StazOn and acrylic stamps aren't the friendliest. They can damage the acrylic stamps if you leave that ink on there. So I don't like to leave my StazOn ink onto that stamp. I'm using some StazOn cleaner to clean it off as best as possible. So I do it twice. After the first time, there was a little bit of ink left or a little bit of buildup of ink left. So I did it a second time. Now, I do typically like to wait maybe about 10-15 minutes before I start coloring. I want to make sure that that ink is really dry. Now, when I'm coloring, it doesn't do anything to the ink. It's when I'm blending it with the gamsol that I want to make sure that that ink doesn't move. I've never had an issue, but I'm always cautious about it. Now, I realized after or towards the middle of filming my coloring that I was doing a really bad job of showing what colors that I was using. So I'm just going to list them in my description, but I'm also going to say all of them right here. And I'm not going to be saying them in order because I wasn't necessarily paying attention to which order. I was just really enjoying the coloring process. So I'm using 1063 50% cool gray, 1051 20% warm gray, and the ones with the least percent are the lighter of the colors. I'm using 1054 50% warm gray, 1056 70% warm gray, so that is the darkest of the grays. Now, I normally wouldn't mix cool and warm, but when I was coloring, again, I was just getting engrossed in the coloring process, so I wasn't necessarily paying attention to whether I was using warm or cool. I had assumed that all the warms were together and the cools were together, but once I started listing my pencil crayons down, I realized that that wasn't the case. For my colors, when I get to that point, I'm using 905 light cerulean blue, 1104 amethyst, 923 pink, and 910 lime green. I can't read my writing here. So when I'm doing my coloring, I start with the lightest colors. I'm doing the grays first. So I'm starting with the lightest of the grays. I'm using a light hand. Anywhere I want it to be a little bit darker, I can be a little bit heavier handed, but I also know while I'm coloring that I'm going to go in with some darker colors. You could always go back and build up that color a little bit more if you find that you got it a little bit too light, and I will often do that. I prefer to be a little bit lighter handed and then go back in and add more color if I find that it's needed. I'd rather do that than accidentally have something a little bit heavier or colored a little bit heavier than I want it to. I've been reading a popular book series lately, the Fourth Wing series, and I don't want to put any spoilers in here for anyone that is currently reading it or plans to, but I got obsessed with the idea of dragons with an interference color to them. So I want this one to be mostly grays, but with a little bit of color in some areas. And then I'm going to do something later that will make it a little bit more iridescent or have a little bit more iridescent shine to it. First, though, I want to get the gray wherever I want it to. And you can see that as I'm coloring, there's areas that I'm not putting any gray on. That's where I plan to add a little bit of the colors later. If after I've added the colors, I feel like I need to add some gray to it, I can always do that. I just don't want to put some gray where I have some color and wish that I didn't have it there. Now you can see that as I'm coloring, I keep going back and forth in different areas. I'll find different areas where I want the shading to be a little bit darker. So I will go in and add a little bit more shading. I will find an area that I haven't colored that I think should have some gray to it. So I don't necessarily color from one end to the other or from top to bottom. I kind of move around on the image. Now I just did black StazOn here to color or to stamp it. I think it would also be fun to, once this was colored and blended, to go back in and stamp with some Versamark ink and emboss it. I'm not sure if it would work over top of the Prismacolor pencil, but I think it would be a really cool look to it. However, with the final result, I really do like the black. I just think the embossing would add some extra dimension to it that would be fantastic as well. So I go back and forth between the lighter and the darker colors, deepening some of the grays in some of the areas that I want. I tend to be fairly reserved when it comes to shading. I've seen some coloring that people have done that, you know, get really, really deep in the shading, and I don't necessarily want it to get that dark because I want to add the color to it. I don't want to add too much dark areas. I don't want it to be too dark in areas. So this here is where I start to add the color. I'm using the cerulean blue or the light cerulean blue first. I'm kind of going in rainbow order. And when I had first started doing the colors, I hadn't planned on adding the green. But when I got to the point where there's little flowers around the outside of the dragon, when I got to that, I realized I was going to need green anyways for the leaves for those flowers. So I figured I'd add just the odd little touch of green to it. There's not very much, and it blends into the blue. But I wanted to just have just a touch of that in there and tie that in with the leaves. So I'm putting some blue in areas, and this is why I was mentioning the green, is because I was trying to go in rainbow order. I was going to do blue, purple, and then pink, and those were the only colors that I was going to add. But because I do go back in later and add a little bit of green, that's where I go a little bit out of order. So after putting blue in some of the areas that I want, I go in with the amethyst and add those right beside the blue, kind of blending them together, kind of overlapping the two colors. I don't want to have clear separation between the blue and the purple or the purple and the pink. So I want them to kind of blend into each other. Next, I go in with that pink, and you can see that even when I go in with the pink, I'll go back in with some purple and add it in different areas where I find that I've missed it or I didn't have quite as much as I wanted. I'm very light with the color for this. Again, you can go back in and be heavier handed afterwards. And afterwards, it's a lot easier to see sometimes where that shading should be. And again, I'm going all over the body. I'm not necessarily going from one end to the other or top to bottom. I will go in and add different bits of pink, and then I'll find that I think I need a little bit of purple beside it. So I'll just add a little bit of purple there, go back in with the blue. So it's really forgiving coloring method when you do this. And then because I'm going in with the gamsol to blend out, and the gamsol dissolves the wax or the pigment in the Prismacolor pencils, and it totally takes any lines out. I'm not too worried if I have coloring lines. So it's a great, very forgiving method of coloring, in my opinion. Once I put the pink everywhere that I wanted to on the dragon, I went and I colored all of those flowers pink. Obviously, you could mix them up and have different colors of them. I want the focus to be on the dragon. I kind of want those flowers to be in the background. So I didn't feel like I wanted to add a bunch of different colors to them, but you certainly could. Here's where I go in with that true green, just adding a tiny little bit in areas just to tie it in with the leaves, and then after that I go in and I color those leaves. And those leaves are really, really tiny, and same with the flowers, they're really, really tiny, so I don't feel like it needs any shading to it. I just color them just a solid color. Once I have my image colored as much as I want, I can start going in with that gamsol and blending it in. Now, when I do go in with the gamsol and blend it, I start with the lightest of the grays first and then work my way to the darkest of the grays. Anytime I feel like I'm getting a little bit too much color on my paper stump, I will use my sandpaper and I will sand that off so that I take any color off of my paper stump, and that way I can make sure that I'm not covering the colors with gray when I get to that. So any area where it is a little bit lighter, I will go in and blend those grays where they're lighter. all throughout the body. And again, just like when I'm coloring, I'm not necessarily going from left to right, top to bottom. I'm working all the way around. Once I have all the lighter areas, I will go for the kind of the medium gray shades, and I will blend them from the darker part of that into the lighter color of that. And another way that blending with the gamsol is very forgiving is once you've done it, you can go back in and do it again. You could go in and do it a third time. It doesn't start to break up the paper or anything, so you don't have to worry about just doing it one time and it being perfect. You can go back in and touch it up. And I love that way of coloring, simply because sometimes if you have to do it quickly and you have to do it perfectly, that adds a little bit of stress to it and anxiety to it. But this, there's no stress to this, in my opinion. I have two different sizes of paper stumps here. The really, really tiny one I'm using for the claws and the horns, just some areas that have really, really fine detail to them. I didn't want to use a thicker paper stump and then accidentally get my color outside of the lines. By having a nice fine one there, I can be very precise with that color. And that works with the flowers and the leaves as well. By using a really fine paper stump, I can make sure that I have that color where I want it to. And when I'm using my sandpaper to sand that color off, I'm sanding it off the side. I don't have the tip of my paper stump perpendicular to my sanding paper. I have my paper stump kind of angled towards the side, so when I'm sanding it still into a point. I'm not dulling it in any way. Once I'm done with that thinner or smaller paper stump, I can go back to the larger one and blend in some of the larger areas. However, it was really, really comfortable in my hand, so I just kind of kept going with it. Once the grays are totally done, I can start working on the colors. And for the colors, I'm also doing those in rainbow order as well. I think I went green, blue, purple, pink. It doesn't really matter if you sand between the colors. I just wanted to be able to color or blend that color between the color and the grays, as well as the color and the color beside it. Now I chose gray as a base for this dragon and added the colors to it. You could also do black if you wanted, or you could go in and say do a blue dragon with some of the iridescent colors, or just do blue all over. My last card with this, I used some interference inks, and I did black and white as a base to play off of those interference ink colors. But they were a fun way to get a little bit of shimmer on that dragon by using the black and the white base and playing with those interference inks. So if you haven't seen that video, I encourage you to watch it, because they create some really fun looks with it by using those interference inks. And if you're not sure about interference inks, I have a whole playlist where I use them. They're so fun to create with and use. They are a type of ink that shows two different colors. So you'll see one color on white or light cardstock and a different color on black or dark cardstock. And I have to say, I'm kind of a little bit addicted to them. So once I have my whole image done, I'm going back in and just seeing areas where either I missed blending it or it could be blended a little bit better. So I'm just doing a little bit of touch up. And this is where you can go as far as you want. And it's nice to be able to keep going back and touching it up if you feel like your blending needs it. Or if you're happy with this result, you can just leave it as is. But just like coloring the first time, I regularly would go back onto that sanding paper and I will sand off the tip of that paper stump, making sure that I don't have any color on there that I don't want where I'm blending. And for some reason, I dip my paper stump in the gamsol and then and then sand it. You don't need to do that. I don't really know why I was doing that. I was even aware of doing it while I was doing it, but I was putting it in the gamsol and then sanding it, or instead of blending it, I was sanding it. It really doesn't matter. After I have my whole piece blended, I'm going to use this iridescent shimmer wax. So this is a product from Prima Marketing. It's called Art Alchemy Opal Magic, and the color that I'm using is called Turquoise Satin. You can see that when I put it on white, it didn't really have color to it. It just had an iridescent shimmer to it. But when you do it on black, it has more color, or you see more of the color to it. I'm using a paintbrush here. It is a flat paintbrush that is a small one. I wanted to make sure that I was able to use the edge of the paintbrush to get into precise areas and use the flat part of the paintbrush to paint larger areas. And when I'm painting, I'm trying to go in the direction of the wings or the body so that if there's any streaks or brush marks, it kind of makes sense with the dragon. I'm going to go over the entire thing. Originally, I was wondering if I should have just gone over the wings and then the belly of the body, but I just really liked it, so I decided to go over the whole thing. Now, this Opal Magic is a beeswax-based paste, and when I was trying to figure out how I was going to make the dragon look iridescent, I didn't want to use my Cloud9 interference pads again because I had already done that. And because the Prismacolor pencils are wax-based, I wasn't quite confident with, say, coloring over top of it with some perfect pearls or painting over top of it. I wasn't sure how things would interact with the wax of the Prismacolor pencils. So because this is a wax-based product going over top of a wax-based product, I figured it would work really, really well. Now, I also want to add a little bit of that iridescent shine to the mat that I put around my piece here. So I have a piece of lunar gray cardstock, and I'm just using that wax to go around the edges. And you can see that as I'm putting that wax, I'm doing straight lines horizontal to the edge of the cardstock. I'm not going in a circular motion. And the main reason for that is if you go in a circular motion, you're going to get a little bit of that wax buildup around the outside of the cardstock edges. And it doesn't look really nice. So once I go in when I go perpendicular to the edge, I can make sure I don't have that build up. There is still going to be a little bit on that edge, so you can see that I went around with my finger to wipe that off to make sure that I didn't have that there. Sometimes it gets a little bit chunky and can flake off, and it just doesn't look nice to have that build up along the edge. So anytime I do that, I try my best to get the rest of that off. I go in and I glue my pieces together, or my layers on top of my card base. And like I said before, this is a 5x7 card. My image piece is cut to 4.5 by 6.5. My mat is cut to 4 3/4 by 6 3/4. I glue those together with some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. Don't necessarily need the fine line bottle for this, but I always have my glue with that. And then once I have those layers together, I put my acrylic block on there and let that completely dry. I wanted to add a little bit of extra texture to this, so I went and used some glossy accents for the eye and then put a little bit of stickles in the center of the flowers. Let that dry, and at that point I thought that's all I was going to do. Then I decided to go in and add a little bit of extra stickles around the edges of the wings and the horns, just a few little areas, just to add a little bit more of that iridescent glitter. It just adds some texture to it. I found, even though I loved the iridescent shine to it, it was still somewhat flat because there wasn't so much texture to it. I also added the stickles to the spines, or spines, I think, on the back. Now, when I had this pictured in my mind, I had planned to do some ink blending on the background, and I kind of got so engrossed in the coloring that I went right to the glossy accents and stickles. And as soon as I had the glossy accents and stickles on there, that's when I remembered that I wanted to do a little bit of ink blending on the back. It looked totally fine the way it is, but I wanted to give it the look of flying in the sky. So I wanted to have a little bit of sky color there. I didn't want the entire thing to be totally blue. I didn't want it totally ink blended. I just wanted a little bit around the dragon there. So I'm using some tumbled glass distress ink with a large Spellbinders brush just to add a little bit of that ink blending, and I really think it makes it come alive. I really love the look of it. I think it looks better with that ink blending than without, but you can see how it looked before and after. To do that, I just used some painter's tape around the edges. I did put the painter's tape onto my shirt a couple times to get some of the stick out of it, to make sure that it was going to come off of the edges of that cleanly. Now, after doing this, I decided I wanted a little bit of extra texture on the dragon scales. So I took my glossy accents and just started putting dots around the edge. Now, or on where I had the texture, where the stamp showed the texture of the scales. Now, because this glossy accents was going on wax paste, it reacted a little bit different than it normally does on cardstock. Normally on cardstock, it doesn't pool out too much when I'm doing little dots, but with this it did, especially if I had the dots a little bit too close together, it did pool out a little bit more. So I found that I had some of the dots joining each other, and I wanted to share with you how I fixed that. I have a piece of scrap cardstock here, and I just used the end part and just wiped that glossy accents up. Normally, if you do this with cardstock, sometimes you'll get a little bit of residue on the cardstock background to show where that glossy accents was. On the wax paste or on the Prismacolor pencils, you really don't see that. So it cleaned up very, very nicely. Then I was able to go back in and just put those dots a little bit smaller and a little bit farther apart, just to be a little bit more in control. I didn't mind if a couple dots had joined together, but that one, especially the one closest to the center of the body, it was quite a large pool that had probably 4 or 5 of them had joined together, and I really didn't like that texture. So it definitely looks a lot better once that has been fixed, but I wanted to let you know how to fix that if you you create this and you have that same issue. It's really easy to fix it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed watching this and just a little bit of a different take on this gorgeous dragon stamp. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.